Well, I'll start by saying, because I know Lynn knows who I am, in part because I'm another Lynn. So I'm Lynn Rainville, and I started teaching at Sweetbar in 2001, and I stayed there until 2018. Now I live over in Stanton, but I've spent these last 25 years studying specifically African-American cemeteries, from cemeteries for enslaved families up through the present. And I'm also a historian for example, at Sweetbar, which is today a college, but the plantation was in part run and built by enslaved individuals when it was a Sweetbar plantation. So some of my research was on the eve of the Civil War. There were 155 men, women, and children enslaved at Sweetbar by Elijah Fletcher and then his daughter, Indiana Fletcher Williams, who had just inherited the plantation when he died in 1858. So I did a lot of research tracing the descendants of those 155 men, women, and children. 10 years ago, up until 10 years ago, 30% of the staff at Sweetbar College was directly descended from those individuals. So a lot of history, generations of Black history connected with this just one plantation that, of course, then later became a college. And I'm happy to take questions throughout the tour on aspects of that community. As you can imagine, this cemetery, there are folks here who, not necessarily anyone here who was enslaved at Sweetbar just because of the time period of the cemetery, but there are folks here who worked at Sweetbar, and in some cases for half a century. In fact, in general, the African Americans who were working at Sweetbar, again, to help build and run it in the 20th century, many of those individuals worked there for many, many decades. I mean, it's thousands of years of work by the Black community that created the college, ran it, and including when it was, today it's returned a little bit to part of its farm background, but really up until 1970s and 80s, it had a working dairy, they were haying, there was a lot going on. And these are some of the same families working that land generation after generation. But today here at the Christian Aid Cemetery, I have to add up front, there are many of you in the audience who already know more about not only the people buried here, of course, but some of the history of this cemetery. This cemetery has been a little bit tricky to research over the years for all sorts of reasons, not least of which, there's not always a clear deed to a cemetery. I can say that in 1933, there was a transfer of an acre of land in this area connected to this cemetery. That was certainly, that's not the original. This cemetery, the very earliest burials here are from the 1890s. But most of the burials are, well, and it's still an active cemetery. So most of these burials are from the 20th century. But part of the rich history here is that while they're 20th century deaths, many of the individuals, it's hard to say exactly because so many of the inscriptions are hard to read, but perhaps 20% of the individuals buried here were born in the antebellum period. So this represents historically the people buried here in their biographies, represents 200 years worth of history, even though the cemetery itself is more recent. Is that a question?
Well,
okay.
I'm listening.
All right, all good. Mm-hmm. And again, please at any point, my plan is, maybe spend the next 40 minutes. And as I said earlier, for those of you who, for any sort of accessibility issues, I'm going to try to keep us on road as much as possible. But for those of you who are able, there are all sorts of inscriptions and symbols that you'll want to take a look at. But I'll try to keep myself and my voice so that if you're on road, you can hear me. And from here, we're going to go, we're going to spend a little bit of time here because this is the earliest section. Then we'll go down to that White House. I'm going to talk about the cemetery down there from the White House so we don't have to go down and up. And then from there, we're going to go back. It's a working shed, for doing maintenance. And then we're going to go back on this road and go out the road. One of the many interesting things about this cemetery is this exceptionally deep ravine that cuts the cemetery in two. But that's part of this, this is the original area. And then there's expansion in that direction and down. And then there's expansion on the other side of the ravine. And then we come to the beautiful rock entrance for that newer section, which, again, it's hard to know exactly, but some of the earliest burials on that side of the ravine are, well, one in particular, 1934, but most of them are 1950s. Whereas over here, we start in like the 1890s. So we can imagine like 1890s deaths, then extending out in this direction as families need more space. And then you start going down the hill, and those are a lot of 1980s, 90s, really last 50 years. And again, on the other side of the ravine, other than the section that's closest to the road, which makes sense because you can imagine it's really this corridor that's the earliest burials, and everything going that way is more recent. So among other things, if you are looking for a family member and you haven't yet found their gravesite, that's your, depending on when they died, if in the last 50 years, you want to be looking at that part of the cemetery. The other thing that I'm hoping to do today, because we don't have time to talk about the biographies of all of the amazing folks who are buried here, is to give you some general tips that apply not just to cemetery, but really any historic cemetery, but specifically African-American cemeteries. And these tips are things like how to locate where the family plots are. What do the different symbols mean? How do you find headstones? How do you interpret some of these inscriptions? So I'm hoping to make it more useful, or more broadly applicable, I should say. And towards that end, and I should add about the deed research. So 1933 is one of the few clear moments of setting aside an acre of land for this cemetery. But again, later in time, its founding, it goes back to a benevolent, or obviously it's named after Christian Aid, Benevolent Society, but it is specifically a Black benevolent society, the sons and daughters of the Independent Benevolent Society. Mm-hmm. That society was founded in 1889 here locally. Mm-hmm. And it must be sometime after that, maybe within the first couple of years, because a lot of these fraternal, sororal, benevolent societies, part of what they do is work on cemeteries, helping people pay for burials and providing land. So my best guess would be that the very earliest burials here come right in those couple years after 1889. And then you have to imagine, obviously none of this is here. So then, and this is an important tip, anytime you're trying to relocate a cemetery, when possible, people like in Judeo-Christian belief system, you pick the highest hill. It's first off, it's the best place to bury because you're further above the water table, and second off, for obvious symbolic reasons, sitting on a hill, closer to heavens. So if you look at this is why I wanted to start us up here, even though you might think that the cemetery started at that stone fence or closer to that road. That's not the real symbolic selection here. It's here on the top of the hill, and we have some really old trees around us. And that's another feature to look for, especially if you're looking for a site that's like out, in a field, or like you really have no idea where the cemetery might be. Start by looking for really old trees, because very often trees bound the edges of a cemetery. Cedars in particular, yuccas, and we'll see a very robust yucca as we walk that direction, because yuccas are those are the bushes. Well, they're behind us. That are filling that plot behind us. Those are the pointy thing. And my favorite, when I first started this work back in 2001, I was walking through a cemetery, and I'm from Chicago, and we don't have plants like that in the north. So I was really unfamiliar with them. And so I asked someone, like, did your family come and, plant these? Like, what are they doing here? And he said that, well, he wasn't positive who planted the first ones, but the reason why they kept them there, because of their pointy little tops, it means that if the devil comes to visit, he's not going to want to sit down. So do with that what you will. Folklore has all sorts of interesting elements to it. But the point is, since they're not native, people have to bring them at some point. And by the way, I want to make sure I emphasize that they are not unique. They do not uniquely correlate with cemeteries. You also find them at old home sites. And it isn't just for Black cemeteries or Black home sites. But if you're like out in the woods and you start seeing yucca, and if you're interested, you probably somewhere around there, you've either got an old cemetery, an old house site, an old mill site, like you've got something that people were working on. And here in cemeteries, sometimes they're planted in lieu of a gravestone. So that's the other complicated thing here. It is hard to estimate right now, especially because the last time I was physically in the cemetery was a decade ago, and there have already been dozens of burials since then. But there are at least 1,000 people buried here. Probably 2,000. And I say that not because of the number of stones, because there aren't that many stones, but you could, like, if you look at this irregular patch of ground between, say, the Jordans and this tree, a lot of that irregularity are depressionists. I mean, people are buried here in unmarked graves. Yep.
Back to the yucca thing. So why would they plant yucca around house sites? Same reason?
Oh, yeah. It's like how people plant tulips. I mean, you're just bringing in an ornamental plant. And so for house sites, they plant it. It's the way we plant tulips today. And yucca, so I will say in full disclosure, I'm not, a botanist, so I can't explain all of the tenaciousness of yucca. But once you plant, it's not as bad as bamboo, but once you plant it, it's there. I mean, you pretty much have to tear it out to get rid of it.
Well, you see it in fields having reproduced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. But of course it is torn out if
Just
someone,
like crepe myrtle.
yeah. Oh, and periwinkle.
Another one.
Oh, our
Which-
cemetery is period.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's so good. I've been studying cemeteries now for 25 years and I still can't. So there is no question. Periwinkle co-occurs with cemeteries. In fact, there have been cases where I've literally been out in the woods looking for a cemetery, not sure where it is. And the first clue is that you start getting patches of periwinkle and you can kind of follow it in. Having said this, and having done a tremendous amount of archival research, I have never, ever found a reference to any mourner, let alone African-American mourner, saying something to the effect of, well, I brought, periwinkle to the grave as like a tulip or a rose or a lily. Never. And as you probably know about periwinkle, it's not the sort of thing, I mean, of course you can make a posy out of it, but it isn't like laying lilies or, so I can't explain to you why it correlates so strongly. And again, periwinkle does not only co-occur with cemeteries, but yes, if you start seeing periwinkle, I mean, take another look because it's very often connected with cemeteries.
Somewhere in, yeah.
Oh, there is not as much as some cemeteries, as far as the eye can see, at certain times of the year, it is all periwinkle. But there are so many unmarked graves here, so many. And as we'll look at some of these stones, even some of the ones that are marked, you can imagine. So there's always going to be a range of cemeteries are no different from residential neighborhoods. You got the wealthy houses, you have the poor houses, same thing with gravestones, for obvious reasons, because most gravestones cost money unless you salvage the stone yourself and hand carve it, of which there also are examples here. And there are also examples in the cemetery of working in cement, which is almost certainly, local. They didn't buy it from a catalog. So the most expensive stones in here, see these black stones here for the Pendletons and McCoys? That's black granite. So first off, granite is the most expensive stone type in any cemetery. Well, I mean, unless you do it out of gold or something. But I mean, granite is always, marble not as expensive. Granite is the most expensive. Granite is also the hardest to carve, the hardest stone to carve. Again, if you're looking at a cemetery, or in this cemetery in particular, there's almost never, granite headstones are not normally found in the 19th century because to carve it, you need better tools. Like today, they're carved with lathe. But even in the past, not only are they expensive, but it takes a while to develop the tools to carve well in granite. That's why marble is so prevalent in 19th century cemetery. Marble is a very soft stone. Marble is also, especially in the 19th century, I mean, it is an expensive stone to procure, especially depending on where you procure it from. Just as an example, any of you are familiar with Sweetbriar, in the White Cemetery at Sweetbriar, there's a massive obelisk. It's 30 feet high. That Elijah Fletcher, the original plantation owner, is buried there. He was from Vermont originally, and that marble was quarried and brought down from Vermont. Again, he was a very wealthy man, and it was a tribute by his children to where he was born. But the helpful thing about granite is, and so granite, black granite or pink granite are also the most, because those are the specialty granite. Most granite is gray. So back here, the Jordan, that stone is granite as opposed to the stone on the right that you can't see from here, but those of us who can will take a look at it in a second because it's a beautiful symbol. That's marble. And then you get slate or schist or field stones. And those are like, for goodness sake, they're all over here now. Of course, there's none that I can easily point to. I mean, they're the ones off in the distance over there. Those, in terms of an inscription, granite inscriptions will last almost forever. I mean, it'll last so long. Marble inscriptions, acid rain, weather, it erodes it. It's hard to read. These like schist or field stones, really hard to read with time, especially with lichen, the moss that gets into the inscription. So you're going to have this whole range here. But in general, again, if you're at any cemetery, if you're looking for someone who died more recently, it's probably a more contemporary stone. And then you have these unmarked stones, and including, like here's one right here. Actually, probably not this one here, but the one over there. See how there are two stones there? Just 15 feet that way in the years of depression. They have no inscriptions, but folks are buried. So let's take a look. Oh, the other thing to know about cemetery, I mean, there's so many things to know. I'm trying not to just pack it all in here because that would get tedious. But the other thing to know about most cemeteries, including cemeteries for enslaved families, is that with very few exceptions, most Judeo-Christian cemeteries are organized around families. So it's not just person, person, person. And the big exception is Quakers, some Mennonites, some of the very egalitarian Christian denominations. As part of their egalitarian beliefs, they bury people in chronological order. And all the stones look alike. There's no difference. So it's just the order you died in. That is very unusual. So it almost like this cemetery, the other public Amherst cemetery, family cemeteries, church cemeteries in this area, families, and sometimes not so much in this cemetery, but in the town of Amherst, the original plots are going to be sold. So it's very, very regular. And I don't know the Amherst one off the top of my head, but the ones in Charlottesville, they're often 10 feet by 10 feet plots. And then if you can't afford a 10 by 10, you do a 5 by 5. Again, it is just like buying up land for houses. And this is an important thing to know because, again, if you're looking for someone, you probably want to wait until you get to the plot that is for the family you're looking for, instead of feeling like you have to read every single stone. Or to put it another way, even though this cemetery looks like you see on here and it looks like there's no real order, there's no rows. But if you look at Google Maps, turn on the aerial view, this cemetery has regular rows and regular plots. But what's happening is some of the stones within the plots, the stones aren't visible anymore, or there weren't stones. So that's what makes it look irregular. Not all plots have something that's formal, but a lot of plots, and I'll point them out when I next see one. This is the very most formal would be to have an wrought iron fence. And again, if some of the fancier cemeteries or if a family had a lot of money, there might be a wrought iron fence. Then you sometimes have just the corners. There's nothing connecting. And so it's really helpful though. I mean, this is obvious because it's all the way connected. But you can imagine if we just had corners, but you were looking for the Carter family, you would want to figure out where those corners are and then start looking within it. And so this, again, back to this idea of where's the nicest part, the most prominent part of the cemetery? It's actually right. Because now we are not just at the top of the hilltop, but even for the hilltop, this is the top. So it makes sense that this family also, and the Carters are a huge family, of course, but that this generation of Carters had that extra money, not only to grab this spot, but to have this really nice plot marker. So now within it, again, even though within it, it's a little this is a little irregular because it's off-centered a bit. Everything here, people are buried like this. And I should add, for those of you, there is so much interesting about this plot. A couple things to notice that are patterns you'll see in different places. So each of these are headstones. They've fallen over. Mm-hmm. If you're working on your own cemetery, and this has happened, first off, and these are schist, by the way, stones, granite, depending how big the stone is, most stones weigh at least 80 pounds. So unless they're really, like this one doesn't. And then they can go up to hundreds and hundreds of pounds. So I say this, only if you feel like you and you've got a spotter and other people are with you. But if you have a stone that's lying flat and the inscription is face up, even if you can't reset it, because it is actually complicated to reset a stone where it does fall over again, at least if you can put it on its side or even ideally upside down, because stones that sit like this, all the rain, all the snow, that is the quickest way to make an inscription so illegible. So that's a horrible direction for them to be having fallen over. But so each of these is a gravestone. These are footstones. So not all headstones have footstones. It's actually something that kind of comes and goes in different time periods in terms of popularity, because gravestones and grave symbols, they have styles change, just like clothing. So in the 19th century, for example, can everyone see the animal that's on top of that low stone?
Yes.
Can anyone tell what it is? Yes, it's a lamb. Again, a biblical reference, a reference to innocence. I can tell you right now, without even looking at it, although now I'm going to cheat a little bit and look, that it's either a woman or a child. And I say that for two reasons. One, the diminutive size of the stone, and second off, lambs in the 19th century are very much associated with not just innocence, but either children or the idea that, somehow we women, I don't know how we got this path in the 19th century, but, we're the innocent, pure ones. It has everything to do with, there's a whole reason for this sociologically and culturally. But suffice it to say, there are two main animals that are carved in 3 dimensions in the 19th century, doves and lambs. And I say this because while this one's actually pretty obvious that it's a lamb, sometimes they get so highly eroded. Honestly, if you didn't know what you were looking at, you would have no idea what it was. But in this case, it's a woman who was in her 40s, who is a Carter, Amanda Carter. But then I would further guess that she probably either didn't marry or was already widowed. Because again, that smaller size, it's just normally, it's a code for, not an older married woman who died. Obelisks, and there are so many variations of obelisks. This one is a fancy one that almost has a top like a Gothic cathedral window, this style. But obelisks run the whole gamut. I'm sure many of you know, architecturally, some of the origins of obelisks are in Egypt, but also, and separate from the tradition in Egypt, are West African obelisk. And the big difference is a West African obelisk has like a curved top almost, not like this, but a curved top, whereas Egyptian obelisks have a pyramidion, which is a 3-dimensional equilateral triangle. For reasons I won't bore you with right now. But in ancient Egyptian religion, there's a very specific symbol to why they have a 3-dimensional triangle on top, the same shape as their pyramids, on top of their obelisks. So this is neither of those because this is inspired by 19th century architectural designs in American architecture. But it's a lovely, lovely stone. When you see an obelisk like this, in almost all cases, it's a family, it's for the family, it's not just one person. So you would want to look at each side. And on each side, indeed, first there's Margaret Carter, then there's Peter Carter. That reminds me. Peter Carter, and a Fitzhugh, the two men who founded that benevolent organization in 1899, was a Peter Carter and a Fitzhugh. And this side doesn't have anything, and that side doesn't have anything. But this is the lichen I'm referring to. This another important caveat. So it is moss. It is natural. It does over time, at the very least, discolor the stone, and it does make it hard to read. If you are trying to clean a stone, please don't use anything other than water and a soft brush. I mean, that's it. No bleach, not Dawn. It's because, unfortunately, sometimes with a lichen, if you rub it off too much, you're going to flake off parts of the stone, especially on schist or not so much granite or marble, but you have to be really careful. So you've got this stone to multiple people, which, by the way, is probably why they angled it, because they probably come out in different to fit them in here. This, I don't know if you can't see very well, but so this has a number on it in a circle, and it's like 8, and it probably has a letter like 8D. So that is extremely unusual because, a family, why would a family refer, they don't have like a legend for who's buried here. Mm-hmm. Almost certainly what this means is that they are reusing this stone, because there are other stones in the cemetery that have these numbers on it. These are being reused probably from a military cemetery, because where you do find this, hospital cemeteries, asylum cemeteries, and some military cemeteries. In other words, when you get just numbers for you either had a mass casualty event, like a war, or a hospital, like in San, we have a couple asylums that were for insane folks in the 19th century. Those burials, to protect the privacy of the people who are institutionalized, they don't have their names on the stone. They have it all by number. And so the only way you know who's buried there, if you're looking for your family, you've got to go back and get that key and translate it. But here, again, I'm not certain the closest, it's Central State. And I can't explain to you how folks, but my guess would be they got thrown out at some point from another cemetery and they were reused. Because it's very unusual for a family cemetery. Oh, and then back to the footstones. So that can also help you orient where people are buried. And it is in almost all cases where their feet are. And the other trick about footstones, any of these stones can sink down. So sometimes, you have more information below ground. So in this case, if Margaret Carter, her initials are here, MC, and here we have PC for Peter Carter. So if you're ever in doubt, how they connect up, it's well worth looking for the acronym of the name connected with the stone. And then you have Amanda Carter, you again have unfortunately a fallen stone, but this one did fall over this way. probably goes without saying, but I would just add also, a lot of these stones are set by gravity, nothing else. So if you sit on them, if you push them over, they will fall. Some of them, like this one probably, although not necessarily, it is possible that this obelisk in the middle has a metal rod that's holding it up, which means it can also fall over. But in that case, you break the stone completely. But I just say this you don't want to lean on these things. And that's unfortunately how some of them fall because of vandalism, and some of them fall because they weren't really set all that well. Any questions here before we move on?
Yeah, I want to know. I know up where I grew up, the older ones sometimes had stories on it of people's lives or poems about. Is that what that is?
Yes. Well, no. Yes and no. So her question is, do stones tend to have stories on them? So there are two ways that I think about stones: inscriptions and epitaphs. Inscriptions are like Bible quotes. They are personalized, but you see them. I mean, they're repeated. There's nothing. The family picked something that they were familiar with that meant something to them or the deceased. Epitaphs are the biographical. So an epitaph might be, principal of the local school, doctor, lawyer, and something that talks about what they did. This one is an inscription. Even though it's personal, you see this is a very popular one. And what it says is, so again, this is from Margaret Carter. She died at about age 70, and she's the wife of Peter. That's another thing you often see, either siblings, but more commonly spouses sharing markers together. So it says, sleep, mother dear, and take thy rest. We loved you, dear, but God loved you best. And the other trick about this particular stone is underneath that, it says erected by her daughter. People don't always, take credit for putting something up like this, but when they do, well, for all sorts of reasons, we don't bury ourselves. And this is an important thing to remember, because sometimes if a family, when a loved one dies, if at that moment they don't have the money for the stone, or the stone that they think, they want to save up money for a particular type of stone, sometimes the style of the stone can be decades later. And that's why sometimes here, like if you see a granite stone that's like, died 1895, I mean, yes, they died in 1895, but that stone must have come much later. And so sometimes you get that connection. Again, I want to make sure we can cover some more ground, but I would just add, for those of you who either come back another moment, again, all along here, like there is the Reverend Staples, that beautiful large marker that's surrounded by all the yucca. So that's him and his family's plot, again, in a prominent spot. There are Higginbothams buried that way. So, again, these are some of the founding families of the cemetery and founding families of Amherst buried up here. I should add for the Higginbothams, but some of you, again, will know this much better than I do. So not in all cases, but in some cases, people enslaved with freedom sometimes take the surname of the family that enslaved them. It happens. It does not happen as often as people think. I mean, just to take Sweetbriar, for example, those 155 folks I mentioned, 2 people took the surname Fletcher of the enslaved. Everyone else took a different surname. Higginbotham, there was a white man named Thomas Higginbotham who died in 1835. He never married. He never had any children that were legitimate. But during his life, he freed multiple people. He was an enslaver. He also freed multiple people, including Archie Higginbotham, who also went by Archie Carey. And when Thomas died, he is buried in a white Higginbotham cemetery that's off on the other side of 29. But it is almost certain that some of the folks he enslaved are also buried with him over there. And then, again, I haven't done this research myself, but presumably maybe some of the Higginbothams buried over here are descended from that large Black community. So that's another time with Higginbothams in a different cemetery. And you folks were already mentioning this with the Eubanks. So if you're looking for an antebellum Black cemetery, and if your ancestors were enslaved, not free, of course, one place to start is the plantation where your ancestors were enslaved. And the easy thing is to start with, okay, where are the white enslavers buried? That really is the easiest place to start, because usually those cemeteries are easier to find. And start there and see if there's either African Americans buried. Sometimes African Americans are buried, like in the Higginbotham case, in the cemetery. Sometimes it's just outside of the cemetery. Sometimes it's in a site that's like within half a mile radius of the white cemetery. And then of course, depending on when folks die. So again, some of the folks buried here who were born in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, enslaved, but they died in the 1880s, 90s, 1900s. And so in death, they've moved away. They moved away from the plantation. They're living in Amherst. They're buried. So a wide area to look for folks. So here, like I said, you've got the oldest part up there. You start going downhill. And now again, from what we just talked about with granite headstones, if you look down these, chunky rectangular granite stones, even without walking down there, pretty much all of those are 1960s and more recent. So there's a handful of slightly earlier stones down here. But again, you can imagine family plots. You start with the core families up here. They lay out their plots. They fill up their plots. More families start burying here. And families need more space, so they start to expand in different directions. From here, so here's an example of one of these concrete stones, most likely locally made for the Rose family, another really large, prominent Black African-American family. Sorry, Black family in Amherst, is what I'm going to say. The other thing to know, I'm sure most of you do, but that little metal marker that's down, so those are provided by funeral homes. They're meant to be temporary until you pay for a stone, but in some cases, folks never replace it. So sometimes you only have them. In which case, especially if it's overgrown or in like 3 more weeks here, and you're in a cemetery that doesn't have as many stones, but just has these little metal markers, you really got to get down and look for them. And they can fall over, and the individual letters can fall out. Oh gosh. Also, and sometimes they're paper under glass. They're very hard to work with if they are not replaced and if they get damaged. But in other cases, people do both. So they had the original temporary marker and then they kept it when they had the replacement marker. But it doesn't mean multiple people. So there, for example, you've got Mrs. Connie Rose on the metal marker and of course also commemorated on her spousal marker. So as I alluded to, see how Mosby, they are there are a couple of different folks, aren't they? But, Sally and Mary, so they're Robinsons. That is a different example. But I'm going to stick with the Mosbys and the Roses when spouses share a marker. So that's a very common pattern when you see 2 people. And sometimes it's obvious, like 2 different stones together. And again, in this case, folks are being laid out this way, but you can imagine between the Ruckers and the Robinsons, you can still see there's depression. There's 100% people buried. This is a very full cemetery. Yes, very dense.
Yes.
It's not empty. Because again, you can imagine originally when people lay out plots, they don't leave space in between the plots. Like you can see that at cemeteries where there are more of the plot markers. It's again, just like real estate. Ding, ding, ding. So that's actually probably an entire family in between the 2, but then they, for whatever reason, weren't able to afford markers. Or the markers are gone. Or the other thing that happens to markers sometimes, because, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, you bury someone, especially when people were buried in wooden coffins, not all these fancy coffins.
Right.
So the coffin disintegrates, the body disintegrates, and you get a naturally occurring depression. And the only reason why you don't see that in every cemetery is that contemporary cemeteries, especially public ones or private ones, they have vaults, they require a vault. Yeah, they artificially make sure that, you might decay, but it's not going to result in depressions because, among other reasons, it's really hard to mow a cemetery that has all the depression. So, they're working towards having it be manageable. But this is what Mother Nature intended. And there are just people, again, buried everywhere. So lots of different, the symbolism, roses, for example, are another popular symbol. You can see them in marble stones, that's granite and hand colored. You can see over here, obviously crosses are very popular. So are flowers. There's a whole kind of symbolism to, again, lilies or roses. Again, a lot of flowers that are either a reference in the Bible or flowers, especially in the 19th century, early 20th century in America, have come to be associated with mourning ritual. It's hard to see from here. Why don't we just take one? I want to show you veteran markers, because veteran markers are another thing you can usually see from a distance.
There we are. We planted one.
Right there.
Thank you.
Right there.
Thank you so much, Bert. We don't have to go down this way. All right, we're going to go back up and down over there anyhow. Thank you. Perfect. Yes, Mr. Mosby. Again, oh my gosh, so
That is a
many.
family member.
Oh, is
The
it?
Roses, the Ruckers, the Mosbys, all of these are family members.
So here, this is World War I in the Pioneer Infantry, the 801st. Or is it the 814? No, I think it's 811. So African Americans, of course, served in all, including Revolutionary War, all of the American conflicts. However, the United States Armed Forces were not integrated until 1948 under Truman. So in World War I, African Americans were in segregated units, and the Pioneer Infantry, not in all cases, of course, but in some cases, African Americans, stevedores. I mean, they were facing death. They were fighting, obviously, the United States, but they were also part of the critical war effort and refueling and supplying folks and facing, high mortality rates in World War I, but in units that were led by white officers, at least nominally. But the veteran markers, and this is a stereotypical, it is a typical one that you get by writing in to request.
Another one from World War II up there.
Yeah, there are actually dozens. Well, there's many veterans, including people who were veterans but who didn't mark it on their stone. I mean, we don't have to use these. And again, they don't bury themselves. The family would have to request this. So not all, even people who served and who won medals, yeah. If you're looking for veterans, this isn't the only way to know who is a veteran in the cemetery, but it is a quick way to look across a landscape. Because as you can already see here, even though it's again, the lichen has discolored it, they're white marble. From World War I and II, the 20th century, they tend to have this curved top. That usually you can see them from far away. So that's a handy thing about them. And you can see how there's a cross and a circle. Yep. In World War I, there are only two options. You either had a circle or you had the Star of David. Today, because armed forces still provide these on request, today there are over 50 symbols that you could pick. So it's many more options today, but in the past, there was those two options or nothing. But usually people would pick one or the other. And then again, if you're doing genealogy, though, to get, like here, the fact that he's a private in the 811, and then you can find folks' draft cards. I mean, it can be very useful to know if someone was a veteran, so you can get into the draft cards, which, by the way, if you haven't looked at draft cards, they have things like height, occupation, next of kin. Like it's a whole additional insight beyond just the census, even if you already have census records or, these.
Census records are so irregular. The 1 year, the name will change. Our ancestors' names have changed 5 different times.
Which one?
Well, just going over one of them, one would be Raleigh Penn. It went from Rolly, Rolie, Religh.
So keep in mind, especially in the past, of course.
Yeah.
So the census, it's one white man. He's the enumerator. He's on a horse. He's out, some days, and you can trace and figure out where he's gone. I mean, my goodness, some days, honestly, there's some heavy drinking going on. I mean, sometimes he's covering you like 20 miles,
yes,
and he's doing it all by, he comes to the household and says, "Oh, sir, are you the head of the household?" And he's doing it just by, he's not doing double checking. He's like, oh, I mean, I saw Jones, of all names, in Augusta County. Jones is regularly spelled Joens. Who does that? Yeah. Anyway, but apparently this one enumerator, he just got stuck in his head that that's what he was hearing.
Yeah.
So you can imagine trying to find who would think to write, I mean, if you're doing a search, Joens. Nobody would. Anyway, so yes, very irregular. This is what happened, I mentioned before about gravity. And you can see from the way this fell, that this was pure gravity holding it. This didn't have anything in it because we would see it. So unfortunately, it's a Tinsley, by the way. I forget who said they were Tinsleys.
Yeah, man.
It's a Tinsley marker, but unfortunately, these pieces go together, and they're an obelisk, a flat-topped obelisk, on this very lovely pediment that fell over. Also, if you see where that love sign is, that is a plot marker.
Right.
So it's not a gravestone. And you can tell that for all sorts of reasons. One, there's no name. Pick up. So this is one corner. See right over there?
That's the other corner.
So that's why it's really helpful. And again, very, very clear question right here. Here's a plot marker someone kicked out of me. They didn't kick it. But this one fell down. The other thing, see this metal right here? So this originally had, of course, a chain that's long gone. And that's something, gosh, there's so many unfortunate things about vandalism in these cemeteries. You know, sometimes people are stealing the metal to recycle. But this is clearly the plot for the family, even though, again, it's got some unmarked graves in it. Oh, the other thing is that, again, in Judeo-Christian cemeteries, the emphasis is on orienting things east-west so that you're facing the rising sun. So that's why these stones, for the most part, are facing this way. So that's why I knew that to come around to this side. So this is, yeah, it's another Edward Tinsley. So the Tinsleys have multiple plots here, you know, going back to the obelisk that fell over, which, by the way, also has a biblical inscription at the base, which is, he that liveth and believeth in me shall never die. So, you know, that's what I'm saying. Lots of combinations of inscription, religious ideas, favorite Bible quotes, or, you know, even references to, you know, mothers who, she was a, you know, a wonderful mother, sister, daughter. And then you get the real personalized one, like, you know, a reverend, we're talking about his background. But so again, here, even though there is a lot going on with these stones, because it's row after row, some are marked, some are unmarked. Finding the edges is really helpful. And then realizing, again, this is a stone that unfortunately has fallen. The inscription is upright, is going up. It's actually a very detailed inscription. And this is the base.
Oh, okay.
So that's what you're looking at. You know, one of these, like a stone like that just fell over.
And this is really interesting, here.
Yeah, and this is,
Over here.
thank you. No, this side. I know it's hard to see here. This is the pearly gates.
Oh.
And there's another one that was over there that I meant to point out. Yeah, so these symbols, and again, having a fancy inscriptions cost money, usually by the letter. The stone costs money, the inscription costs money. And then, of course, if you have carved it, like especially if it's like a work of art, that costs money. So it's only on the fancier ones you get this. But and I believe me, I can only tell that because I know what this is. I would never have otherwise known what this was. But I've seen it a lot. It's the pearly gates, and usually they're open, of course, because if they're shut, that's not such a great sign. And then usually those are accompanied by some sort of Bible quote. So yes, that's a beautiful design. All right, let's get ourselves out and around down to the newer part. But in the meantime, one of the loveliest plot, like I said, the enclosures for plot can be metal, can be stone, but one of the most time-consuming ones here is over here, because they've hand-set crystal rock, right, quartz, all the way around. Absolutely beautiful. So if you want to stay on road, but if you want to check it out, to walk when we're going that way. And then here are some of the yucca that I was talking about. Yeah. That were clearly planted at grave sites. And then the yucca, again, Mother Nature doesn't stop for anybody. All right. So now, again, a little bit counterintuitively, but now we're in the more recent part of the cemetery, closer to the modern day entrance. And again, you can see a lot of granite here. The earliest stones, again, 1934, it's actually a marble stone that's got heavily, there's a lot of lichen on it. It looks blackened, but that was the earliest one that I found in this whole area. Otherwise, most folks here are like last 50 years or so, 1970s. So you got a lot of the granite. One of the things that happens with granite is the carvings can get very ornate. So especially, I forgot to point one out up there. So some of the carvings though, they're from a photograph. I mean, they're beautiful. Yeah. And that those like, well, even here, I mean, Miss Brown, Mercedes, you know, with that beautiful drawing of, I think, a lily. I'm so bad.
Iris.
Iris, thank you so much. Like I said, I never clam really bad with flowers. And that black granite and the fact that the stone is asymmetrical, that is a very fancy stone.
That was recent.
Yeah. Also very recent. Yes. Yeah. So the more recent stones, you can get, I mean, if you're willing to pay the money for it, really fancy symbols, as opposed to more traditional granite carving are things like here, like the roses. In the background, there are other flowers, including ivy. Ivy is often a symbol for immortality. And what can we see from here? We have more veterans buried here. Like you said, someone I think mentioned, from now we're in World War II. You know, if it hasn't already been clear, for those of you doing family research, for everything you can do in a census, world history, like there's so many great sources of information, it's always worthwhile, if you can, to figure out where someone's buried, because you just never know what might be on the stone. Like, you know, even here, Mary Henley,
That's my grandmother.
Pardon?
I know who that is.
Tree right
Oh,
there.
well, yeah.
She's my grandmother.
This is tree.
Right.
Yeah, that is your grandmother. So, right, you know, the adding in mother, not in this case, but in some cases, you might not know if someone had kids or not, and you get to their gravestone, and that's your next clue to be like, okay, let's figure out who her children are. She's obviously buried to your grandmother, Mary. Do you know where she was born in 1883?
In Amherst.
In the town.
About 16.
Okay, out 60 West.
Uh-huh.
Okay. And there are a lot of, like, as I mentioned before, and you might know him, Eddie Fletcher, Jasper Fletcher. So he lives out at 60 West, but also he is one of the descendants of those, of two folks in particular, James and Lavinia Fletcher, who were born in the 1830s and married at Sweetbriar. Well, out 60 West, and these are Fletcher's Roses. He has at least two family graveyards that are hard to find, let's just say, because they're on private property today, where there are Fletchers and Roses, and I'm forgetting another related surname that I can't think of right now. But that's a good example of, you know, where other relatives might be buried in a cemetery that's harder to find. And then, you know, from here, if we turn around and look, now you can also see in these more contemporary graves, people are planting small bushes. People are planting tulips. People are using, you know, sometimes just wood, like this area right here that's tulips, and then wooden markers, like eight wooden sticks.
Yeah.
Like that is another version of a plot, you know, putting the outlines of a plot. And sometimes you especially see this in some of the old Black cemeteries in Lynchburg, that not only do they have an outline for a plot, but every single burial, it's headstone, and then they outline where the body is. Again, it takes a lot of extra effort, a lot of extra money, but that's a kind of a version of that for someone. Somewhat ironically, they don't seem to have a headstone, but so that's what you get this whole range of fancy headstones, no stones, but people remember where folks are buried, which obviously is why oral history is so important. Yeah, so very, very important. Because sometimes the only thing that remains is a plant, some sort of planting or yucca bush, and you're going to have to ask folks. But here you can get a really good sense of, look at this road right here, market. That is it's in a very, very straight. These are line after line after line of folks that are buried, you know, again, going this way. And I assure you, there's just very little space left in the cemetery.
It is.
So it's folks all the way down, whether or not they have a marker or not.
Yeah, a lot of them down.
And then you still get variability in whether it's, especially here, granite or marble, and then what symbols they pick.